Welcome to day 213 on the trail. We have four readings for today. From Mark chapter 12 verse 41 through 13:37, 1 Kings chapter 5 verse 1 through 6:38, 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1 through 5:14, and 4th Maccabees chapter 7 verse 1 through verse 23. Our reading from Mark today contains literature which is defined as apocalyptic. We have not experienced this style of writing yet in our readings along the trail. Now, while this type of writing may seem mysterious and unfamiliar, apocalyptic literature is a literary genre found in other documents in the Bible, such as Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation. So, what is apocalyptic literature? Traditionally defined, apocalyptic literature involves a revelation given by a heavenly agent, such as an angel, regarding a transcendent reality, which is then set in a story-driven framework. What might make this type of literature confusing is the number of references to previous events that it uses. So to understand the main point of a passage, which is utilizing apocalyptic imagery, we have to know the reference which are being used. Also, we should avoid assuming that apocalyptic literature is predicting some distant future. Instead, the message is often intended to encourage the immediate reader. So in Mark 13, we begin by looking at what occasions Jesus' discussion with his disciples. Beginning in verse 1, as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings!" Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." So what observation causes the disciples to ask about the end of the age? When the disciples point out the buildings on the Temple Mount, Jesus tells them that despite the magnificence of the temple, everything they see will be destroyed. For the disciples, and perhaps Mark's readers as well, a cataclysmic event that would bring about the destruction of the temple and the fall of Jerusalem would also herald the end of the age and the return of Jesus. And they are not without cause in their assumptions. Large portions of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel reflect on the destruction of the first temple in apocalyptic terms. In our readings from 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles about the construction of the first temple, you can see the sense of importance that it held in Jewish life. Therefore, Jesus will use similar apocalyptic imagery in his description of the events that the disciples will encounter. The second temple, which the disciples were viewing that day, was destroyed by the Romans under Titus in AD 70. This caused tremendous suffering for the Jewish people. According to Josephus, approximately 1.1 million people died in Jerusalem during the Roman siege. While this was doubtlessly an end-of-the-age event, Jesus also seems to blend these first-century events with references to his eventual return. Later, 4 of Jesus' disciples ask him to provide a timeline for these events. Verse 3, when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" As we have already seen throughout our readings, mountains and hillsides play an important role, from Mount Moriah to Mount Sinai to the Mount of Transfiguration. For people in the ancient world, mountain summits were places where they went to meet God. In a sense, they climbed to that place where the earth touched the heavens. They ascended these heights to see God and to be seen by God, to hear from God, and to be heard by God. Here on the Mount of Olives, God had stopped back to gaze over Jerusalem before departing the first temple prior to its destructions by the armies of the Babylonians. Since God paused on the Mount of Olives when he left Jerusalem, prophetic texts suggest that when he returned, he would once again stand on the Mount of Olives before entering the city. So this is what provides the backdrop to Jesus' discussion with his disciples. While we do not have time today to discuss all of the details surrounding Mark 13, we can explore a couple of the more puzzling elements. We will see this discussion again in Matthew 24. We will explore more of this conversation between Jesus and his disciples at that point. In verse 14, Mark mentions a desolating sacrilege and even signals the reader that there is a deeper message here. Beginning in verse 14. But when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains, and the one on the housetop must not go down or enter the house to take anything away. The one in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not be in winter. So what is the desolating sacrilege that Jesus is referring to in verse 14? In Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, we find a abomination of the desolation that describes an idol erected on the temple altar in Jerusalem. This act of sacrilege occurred in 167 BC by Antiochus IV Epiphanes as part of his attempt to wipe out Judaism. We are currently reading about the horrors that Antiochus IV inflicted on the Jewish people in 4th Maccabees. This desolating sacrilege, along with Antiochus's oppression of the Jewish people, instilled a lasting and dreadful image in the minds of the people. Jesus adopts this same language to indicate that a similar desecration of the temple will occur in the future. Since the Second Temple will be destroyed by the Romans in AD 70, some scholars suggest that Mark is connecting the actions of the Romans with the desecrating acts of Antiochus IV. In verses 24 through 27, Jesus makes it clear that his return will not be done in secret. Instead, it will be unmistakable. Beginning in verse 24. But in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds, with great power and authority. Then he will send out the angels, and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. We have heard Jesus call himself the Son of Man before, but here he is referencing imagery found in Daniel 7. We will cover this reference in detail when we come to the book of Daniel, and again in Matthew's Gospel. However, for now, the title Son of Man is an important reference to the establishment of God's kingdom over all the nations of the earth. Finally, and here's the biggest question, what does Jesus say about the timing of the end of the world? Beginning in verse 32, Jesus says, "But about that day or hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come." Verse 32 clearly states that Jesus himself does not know when the end of the age will occur. Only the Father knows when the end will come. Therefore, we should treat with great skepticism anyone who claims to have determined the timing of Jesus' return. But what does it mean to keep alert or keep awake? Since even Jesus does not know when he will return, we are to be ready at any moment. Matthew will help expand on this definition and what it means to be ready in the three passages that follow this same morning in Matthew 24 and 25. In those chapters, we find the parable of the faithful servant, the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, and the parable of the talent. In all of these examples, the necessity for proactive watchfulness is emphasized. We should not be passively waiting for Jesus to return. Instead, we are to be faithfully watching and preparing for him at each moment. As we continue along the trail, we will begin encountering additional apocalyptic literature. And one truth that we should recognize is that if the writings of the Bible were not meaningful to the people who first read them, then why would they bother passing them along to us? Their experiences, the suffering they faced, the hardships they endured, the tragedies they prayed through, were all important. They are not merely a backdrop to our story. Their lives, their families, and their children were no less significant and relevant than ours. Their stories are blessings that have been shared to inform us, future generations. Apocalyptic writings, such as those found in Daniel and Revelation, are not a collection of ambiguous codes that were copied down and passed along until they could be properly interpreted several millennia later. Instead, we find in these writings the voices of faithful disciples who traveled with God along the difficult and perilous roads of suffering and uncertainty. They remind us that we are a people defined by hope, a people who see in every end a new beginning. Beginnings which are permeated by opportunity and possibility. And that hope breeds a steadfast courage that the world desperately needs, now more than ever. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.